So in 20 minutes, 18 minutes, I'm going to reverse the modernist revolution. So stick with me as I go through this. So you probably saw that this year the AIA gave their largest, the biggest award for design to Julia Morgan. Julia Morgan was a turn of the century, early 20th century Beaux-Arts architect and arts and crafts architect. And she was the first notable thing, she's the first woman ever to have received this award in its 100-year history. But equally notable for me today is she's the first non-modernist to win this in half a century. And so for me, that may be a coincidence, but for me, I think this is evidence that there's a thawing now from mainstream modernism towards traditional architecture. And that gives me an opportunity today to go back and look again at that revolution that took place and to see if we could rethink some of the ideas that happened there. So in now 17 minutes, I'm going to tell you the essence of what traditional design is. I'm going to explain how modernist design came in, rejected traditional design, and took over as the status quo. I'm then going to try to show that their revolution wasn't quite as final as we might have thought, that many of the ideas they developed to justify this really don't work. And in fact, they look more like traditional architects than they would like to admit. And indeed, I'm going to finish by arguing that they're just another version of traditional design. So are you still with me? So what's traditional design? What do I mean by traditional design? This is the way people have designed buildings, villages, towns, and cities for the entire history of human civilization until just the last 50 years. And to give us some sense of the scale of this, I'm going to take the 10,000 years of civilization from the time the hunter-gatherers first settled down, started building buildings, increasingly complex villages, towns, and cities. 10,000 years, I'm going to put it in a 1-hour clock. So 1 minute passed, we've settled down as hunter-gatherers and started building, and 60 minutes later, we've reached 2014. So bear with me as we go 10,000 years through the hour. So for the first half hour, we hadn't even invented writing yet, and yet we were still building very significant structures and villages and towns. So we're halfway through civilization, and we're just sort of getting wound up using this model of traditional design that I'm going to talk about. The ancient world that takes us through Greece and Rome and up to the demise of the Roman Empire gets us to about 10 minutes to the hour. So just in the scale of how long have we been building, we're at 10 to the hour when we're finishing up the Roman Empire. Here's the one that surprised me when I did this. The Middle Ages, getting us up to the Italian Renaissance and the creation of all those great Gothic buildings, someone asked about that earlier, we're now 3 minutes to the hour as we hit the Italian Renaissance. And if we go finally, the Renaissance to the mid-20th century, when the modernists finally did their revolution, we're to about 22 seconds before the hour. So the modernists we're going to see in the last 22 seconds of civilization have suggested that we could throw all of this away and find another way to do this that would be better. So we're going to look at what does that do. So the first principle of traditional architecture, you're looking for a definition. The most fundamental idea here is that the source of form, where does an architect get his or her design idea when designing a building? It is that buildings beget buildings. If you're about to design a building, which is the question mark there, what have we done all through civilization? We look back to other buildings. And we find buildings that have some idea that we might be able to use. We pick up the things that make sense. We adapt them to our current realities. We bring in some other ideas and we make something new out of this idea that we look to the past. So you want to invent a building, go look at another building. The second idea that's key to traditional design is that throughout civilization, when architects were looking back to precedents, they were explicitly choosing those precedents. They didn't just randomly say, oh, gee, I kind of like that, why don't I do this? They always chose those precedents to express very specific desired human values. So, for example, this great Lechen's house on the left, this sort of medieval arts and crafts idea, this was part of a movement in the end of the 19th century, a very explicit reaction to the industrialization of the 19th century, increasing concern about the splits in society, the alienation from nature, the alienation from handcraft, And these people, including the artists and architects, looked back and said, when was a time in the world when things were more harmonious? And they said, well, you know, that was the Middle Ages. So we will explicitly revive the traditions of the Middle Ages and bring those up to the late 19th century as a way of explicitly saying, this is what we stand for. Similarly, the Greek revival, beginning of the 19th century, at the time of the Greek War of Independence, it was a way of showing solidarity with independence, with the Greeks, and it was a way of expressing the relationship to democracy. These were not just random or arbitrary, these were conscious decisions about values connected to architecture. And so if you just follow these two ideas of looking back, buildings beget buildings, and you choose buildings and adapt them to your present reality, we in fact see the rich tapestry of history in architecture. In this case, we see a Roman triumphal arch turns into a Baroque church, turns into an 18th century British church, turns into stone in the 19th century, turns into various versions of arches in 19th and 20th century Great Britain and America, and in fact even ends up with Frank Lloyd Wright with his interesting use of arches on the Marin County Courthouse. An even more interesting little family history here is we start with the Roman Basilica, which leads to the Romanesque church, which leads to the Gothic church, which leads to the Gothic revival I just talked about, which led to the reappreciation of the Middle Ages and medieval architecture, which leads to the arts and crafts at the end of the 19th century, which leads to that second to the right image, still the half-timber paradigmatic domestic house in Great Britain and America, still being built today, and even to the beginnings of Frank Lloyd Wright and the Prairie School. So buildings beget buildings, buildings adapt to their new realities. And so if we see the essence of traditional design then, it is that shared precedents create styles over time. What does style mean? Style simply means there's a family of resemblances. You pick up an idea from the past, you adapt it, you change it, it still has some family of resemblance to something before, and collectively we can look at the work that architects have done and say, well, that's got a kind of stylistic similarity to it. And those are going to the shared precedents create the styles over time. And so if we look at a timeline, and this is pay attention to this because the modernists are going to mess this up. So here we are at the present, and we're going to design a building, and so we look to the past, and we inherit something that makes sense. We pick it up and we adapt it to our present reality. We bring other things into it. And if we do this really well, we may invent some new idea that makes so much sense that people in the future will look back to us and say, yep, that's a precedent I want to do. And so we pass this on to the future. And my good colleague at the University of Colorado, Denver, Keith Lofton, has described this as a design conversation across time. So this is the essence of the traditional idea of design. This is what we've done through all of our history until 22 seconds before the hour. So the modernist idea. What was the modernist idea, the great revolution that threw away this history that we have used for so long? Well, it starts, first of all, if we look at the source of form, it is buildings no longer beget buildings. This is the key difference between the modernists and the traditionalists. Why not? Why don't we look at buildings anymore? Well, it comes in large part from the results of the First World War when they were starting their revolution. As you know, the First World War almost brought Europe to its knees, almost destroyed the society in Europe, wiped out a generation of young men, absolutely turned over a lot of their assumptions. And there was a feeling at the time among many people, including the architects, that there was nothing to learn from the past. Whatever we had in the past brought us to the brink of destruction, and so we must turn away from that, and we have to create a new world that's solving new problems. So this is the whole outlook of this time. And so to quote Walter Gropius, old buildings are old solutions to old problems. So why on earth would we ever look at another building again? Because that's simply an old idea. And therefore, it wasn't just live and let live. Okay, fine, we want to do our thing, you do your thing. They had to prohibit this. This was not going to be allowed anymore because this was a return to the past that would bring us to destruction. So if we look at the source of form then for the modernists, well, look, oops, what happened? We just lost the past. We can't look to the past at all. There's nothing there of any value for us that's going to help us in what we do. And unfortunately, since we in the present are now the past for our future, that means we're cut off from the future as well. So we're now in this modernist view living entirely in the present, the eternal present, nothing to learn from the past, nothing to pass on to the future. We'll just solve our problems today and then we'll deal with another problem tomorrow. So then you have to ask though, and the architects in the room will know what I'm about to say, so what's the source of form? If you can't look back anymore to see get your building ideas from other buildings, so where do you get your architectural ideas? Well, Walter Gropius gave us this one. Well, we won't let you look at buildings. We'll teach you a language of abstract visual form. This is a language of harmony, symmetry, proportion, balance. It's what's behind all architecture, and not just architecture, behind all art. Anything that's visual, that's the language we will teach you. Did anyone in the architecture room do the spots and dots and the abstract stuff when you were in architecture school? So that's it right there. And along with that, we will teach you a method for solving problems. So don't look at buildings, but if you get this language and you get this method for solving problems, you'll be able to invent new buildings no one's ever seen before. And so the architects in the room will recognize this. So what did you do? Well, you didn't look at buildings, but you looked at the program, the site, the technology, the resources, this language of abstract visual form. You applied your method, and voila, presto, architecture. So it's not buildings beget buildings, problem-solving methods beget buildings. And this is the way architects have been trained all throughout the world for the last 50 years. No precedent, never looked at a building before, because every problem is unique, every design is unique. Since every design is unique, there's no family of resemblance then, so therefore there's no more style. And style, by the way, the modernists managed to take a very useful word and turn it into something really mean and nasty. Style for them meant something trivial, about fashion, superficial appearance, and that's what all the traditional people did. But since they don't do style, they don't have that problem. So style is now superficial, but they aren't one of those. It's a very ingenious idea, and I grudgingly have to say I give Walter Gropius full credit for having pulled off the revolution of 10,000 years. He managed to turn upside down 10,000 years of how to build buildings, and in one generation got us all to abandon this way we'd done things before. So I give full credit. Great strategist. Unfortunately, it didn't work. And we only have to look, I'm just looking at the skyline of Chicago here, to say, oh, come on, now give us a break. Are these all uniquely original buildings? Looks to me, if we just look at all these buildings done in Chicago by all these different architects in modernism, there's a family of resemblances there. Similar forms, similar treatment of the surfaces, similar structure construction, no reference to any historical past. They're looking at each other. They're looking at precedents. They're just not looking at the precedents that the traditional architects were doing, but they're not doing anything differently here than the traditional architects have been doing for 10,000 years. And so I would argue the modernists are style just like all the rest. And I use style in the nicest way. It's a family of resemblances. So if we look at this tapestry of history, well, what we know is it didn't just spring from nothing. They, in fact, looked at buildings in the past. They used precedents. They adapted them to their new realities. Modernism is a style like all the others we've done through history. And they're same source of form. They weren't fundamentally different. Their source of form was in precedents, and those precedents evolved over time. And in fact, we have a wide panoply of modernist styles as well that sort of begins to match what we've seen through history. The ideas that generate this haven't really changed. Now, it's also true that the modernist buildings embody values, just like the traditional architects did. You chose styles because it represented your values. But modernism is ambiguous about values. When modernism was first invented after the First World War, it was identified very explicitly with socialism. That was part of the reaction to the bourgeois values that brought them to the chaos of the First World War. And modernism originally was about housing for the worker, not a home for Fred and Mary. This was about socialism, but that didn't sell very well when they brought it over to America in the 30s during the Red Scare. So over time, modernism began to distance itself from that, and increasingly one aspect of it talked about, we're not really about values, we're just a problem-solving method. We just solve the problems of today, so we aren't about values. The other stuff is about values, and we don't like their values, but we don't have to talk about that with us. Well, of course they are. They represent values. They represent a view about technology, about simplicity, about no overt references to our heritage. They are not about an individual region or a place, but about a universal idea. And many of the clients for this are choosing this style for exactly the reasons, like the national and multinational corporations love this style because that reflects the values of being beyond the boundaries of one place, about power, about structure, about efficiency. These are values like any others. They're values you can either admire or not. You can admire the values in the traditional ideas or not, but all the buildings we've done, traditional and modern, have had these values embedded in them. And so I'm arguing in the little time I have left that modern and traditional are not fundamentally different. We have set ourselves up. We've set ourselves up to be patsies, I would have to say. We keep trying to defend this, a traditional view of architecture. We're trying to defend this from modernism, and I don't think we have to do that anymore. It's just they're in the same family we are, and we can have a different kind of conversation about this. We're not fundamentally different. Buildings beget buildings for both traditional architects and modern architects. And these styles are chosen to express certain desired human values. Works for all of them, and this is the conversation that we need to have. So what lessons do we learn from if we see this as all part and parcel of the same thing? What would that suggest we do? Well, first of all, for the profession of architecture, it suggests that we really do need to embrace a wider range of values, and therefore styles to match the diverse society we serve. I hear a lot from my colleagues who are modernists. They bemoan the fact that the profession of architecture is kind of losing control of the design of the built environment. They're not given enough responsibility to design more of it. And I would argue, well, it might be because of the full range, the full palette of possible values that we could be building and have built. We've only been offering the public a little subset of that. And if they didn't like those values, it was sort of tough luck because we weren't going to do anything else. I'm preaching to the converted in this room, but the range of work that you do is in fact broadening that palette, and someone earlier today said most of your clients are probably in that wider palette anyway. So this argues, let's get past this modern and traditional, let's get these out, and let's offer a wider range of possibilities. For architectural education, the first thing is, been my pet peeve for many, many years, abandon this abstract basic design idea. This is a really bad idea. This cuts students off from the real source of form, which is buildings. And as long as we don't show them buildings, they're not really getting to the heart of learning what their skills are. I have described this in the past. This is like if you asked me to teach you French. I said, I'd love to teach you French. First, I'll teach you the universal syntax behind all human languages. And once you've learned that, it should be relatively easy to speak French without very much trouble at all. And of course, you know it doesn't work that way. You want to learn French, you mimic people who speak French, you internalize eventually that syntax, you can say creative things all you like, but didn't come from an abstract vocabulary. So we got to get rid of that idea, get students to be looking at buildings again. And we also have to support students in exploring a wider range of styles. And of course, you just heard that's one of the things we're now doing at the University of Colorado, Denver, with our offering the ICAA certificate with our program, is to give our students an opportunity to explore a wider range of ideas. So we need to restart a bigger conversation about choices. We need to focus again on the power of precedence for creating buildings. And in my own way, I've tried to start with this with an article I just, thanks to Clem Levine and all his team, an article I did for them last year on making room for traditional architecture. I looked at 5 reasons our modernists always give us why we should never do traditional. I've tried to show those are in fact red herrings. Those are sort of false. Any argument they do there, you can apply it to modernism as well. And so don't be distracted by those. These are the key questions that we need to be focusing on. We need to talk about the choices, and we need to talk about the power of precedence for our designs. So finally, we get back to Julia Morgan. Julia Morgan finished her career and she was despondent. By the time she got to the end, the modernists had won the day, and she believed that everything she'd learned, everything she'd done in her career had been repudiated and rejected and was never going to happen again. And in fact, when she closed her office in 1951, she told the manager of the building, please destroy all of my files and my blueprints. My clients will have their drawings to keep up with their houses. No one else will ever care again about what I did. And so there was a feeling of the war was won and this had all changed. Well, I hope I've shown you today that in fact what Julia Morgan was doing was in the tradition of 10,000 years of civilization, and the modernists were doing it as well. It was just different values, and indeed the values that Julia Morgan represented and built are the values that many of you in the room are so admiring as well. So I would say Julia Morgan has been vindicated at this point, and it's time for us to get on and move forward with, without making excuses for traditional architecture. Thank you.